The hammer slipped from Esther Bell's fingers and clattered against the schoolhouse roof, spinning twice before it caught in the gutter, and the sound of it rang out across the dusty main street of Caldera, New Mexico territory, in the late summer of 1882 like a gunshot that nobody had fired yet but everyone was waiting for. She did not flinch. She had stopped flinching at loud sounds sometime around her 26th birthday, which had passed unmarked 2 months ago in this same town that did not know her well enough to remember it. She steadied herself on the pitched roof, both boots flat against the sun-warmed shingles, her dark skirts pinned at her knees with a length of rope she had borrowed from the livery stable that morning without asking, because asking meant explaining, and explaining meant justifying, and she had grown very tired of justifying the things she needed to do. Below her, on the street and in the doorways and leaning against the hitching posts with their thumbs in their belt loops, the men of Caldera had stopped what they were doing, every last one of them. A dozen pairs of eyes tilted upward, shaded by hat brims, all of them watching the widow schoolteacher on the roof with the torn American flag spread across her lap and a needle threaded with heavy linen cord held between her teeth. The flag had been torn in a storm 3 nights ago. A line of thunderheads had come rolling in from the Sandia Mountains, with the kind of fury that reminded everyone in Caldera that the land here was not tamed and never would be. And the iron pole above the schoolhouse had bent 6 degrees westward, and the flag, which had been the pride of the town council and had been ordered from Santa Fe at considerable expense, had been ripped clean along its lower field, the red stripes parting from the white ones like an old argument finally spoken aloud. Nobody had done anything about it for 3 days. Esther had watched it flapping in the dry morning wind, that ragged lower edge snapping against itself, and she had felt something twist in her chest that she did not have a clean word for. She was the schoolteacher. The schoolhouse was her domain. The children who came through its door every morning looked up at that flag when they said their recitation, and what did it mean to ask children to place their hands over their hearts and pledge themselves to something that was already coming apart? So she had gotten up before first light, retrieved needle and thread and the spare canvas from the supply chest, climbed out through the upper window and begun. The men watched. She could feel them the way you feel a weather change, a pressure against the skin, a collective held breath. She had been in Caldera for 14 months, long enough for the gossip about her to have made all its necessary circuits. She was the widow of Thomas Bell, who had died of a fever in Albuquerque before they could make it to the land grant he had purchased in good faith from a man who turned out to have no legal right to sell it. She had arrived in Caldera with a single trunk, $22, a teaching certificate from a school in Ohio, and a grief she wore so close to the surface that people either moved toward it or moved away fast, and most people moved away. She pulled the needle through the heavy canvas, drawing the torn edges together with small, tight stitches, each one deliberate and even. The sun was climbing and the roof was getting hot and her fingers were pricking with sweat, but she did not stop, and she did not look down at the men watching her, because she understood in the particular way that women on the frontier understand these things that the moment she looked down and acknowledged them, the moment would mean something it had not meant before, and she was not ready for that yet. One by one, the men drifted back to their business. The blacksmith returned to his anvil. The general store owner stepped back inside. The 2 cowboys from the Patterson ranch remounted and rode on. The barber leaned back through his door. The banker's clerk straightened his sleeve garters and turned away. The town marshal scratched the back of his neck and went to find his coffee. One man stayed. She knew he was there before she looked. She had always known. She would realize later, in the way you know a storm is coming before you can name the clouds. There was a quality to his stillness that was different from the others, not the stillness of someone idly watching, but the stillness of someone who had decided something and was waiting to see if the decision held. She looked down. Isaac Quinn stood in the dust below the schoolhouse, hat held in both hands at his waist, Not leaning, not lounging, not performing the casual indifference that men on the frontier wore like a second skin. He was looking up at her with dark brown eyes that had something in them she could not immediately name, something careful and direct and almost painfully honest. And the expression on his face was not admiration, not the hollow appreciation men sometimes directed at her when they thought they were being subtle, but something closer to recognition, as if he were seeing her properly for the first time, and understanding that she was more complicated than the story the town had told about her. He was 31 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with the kind of hands that belonged to a man who had worked hard and long and never once complained about it. He wore no gun on his hip, which was unusual enough in Caldera to be a statement. He had been in town for 11 days, staying at the boarding house on Elm Street, working as a surveyor for the territorial government, mapping the land grants that were being contested all across this part of New Mexico in the legal chaos that followed the Lincoln County War and the 100 smaller wars that had followed that. She had not spoken more than a dozen words to him. She had noticed him because she noticed things, but she had kept the noticing at a distance, filed away in the part of herself she was not ready to open. He cleared his throat. "You want someone to hold the pole steady." She stared at him for a moment. "The pole is fine. It bent in the storm, 3 degrees west, maybe 4. I have a level in my kit." She looked at the pole. She had thought it was 6 degrees. She pulled the needle through the canvas. "It does not affect the repair I am making." "No," he agreed. "It does not, but when you rehang it, it will hang crooked." She sat back on her heels and looked at the pole more carefully. He was right. She had been so focused on the fabric that she had not thought through the full problem. That irritated her, but she was honest enough with herself to know that the irritation was with the oversight, not with him for pointing it out. "Fine," she said. "Get your level." He did not smile, which she appreciated. He nodded once, replaced his hat, and walked toward the boarding house, and Esther Bell watched him go and then turned back to her stitching and told herself very firmly that one act of practical helpfulness was not a thing to build anything on. She would be wrong about that. Isaac Quinn had come to Caldera with a commission from the General Land Office, and a dark past he carried the way you carry a wound that has healed badly, knowing the scar tissue is there every time the weather changes. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died when he was 11, and he had come west at 22 with a surveying team and had never gone back, which told its own story about what there was to go back to. He had been married once briefly to a woman in Tucson named Clara, who had left him 18 months into the marriage for a cattle buyer from El Paso, and who had been entirely right to do so. He had concluded after a year of painful self-examination, because he had spent those 18 months so consumed by the work of survival and contract and duty that he had essentially abandoned her in the middle of a house they shared without ever physically leaving it. He had learned something from that failure that he had been unable to apply until now, which was that the most important betrayal was not the dramatic one, the one with a packed bag and a note on the kitchen table, but the slow, invisible one, the daily choice to keep yourself at a distance from the person standing right beside you. He had been keeping himself at a distance for 9 years since Clara had left. He was good at it. He had elevated it to a kind of art. But standing in the dust below the Caldera schoolhouse, watching Esther Bell stitch a torn flag back together, with the focused determination of someone who had decided that the world was going to be made right one small piece at a time whether it cooperated or not. He had felt something in him that was the opposite of distance, a pull toward her so direct and uncomplicated that it startled him, because nothing about his inner life had felt direct or uncomplicated in a very long time. He got his level from his kit and came back and held it against the iron pole while she climbed carefully down from the roof, and they assessed the damage together, standing close enough that he could smell the dry grass scent of her hair, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched longer than a moment should. "I can fix this," he said finally. "I have the tools. It will take an hour. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "I do not want to take your time." "I am surveying the school property tomorrow anyway," he said. "The land grant on this parcel is one of the disputed ones. The town needs a clear boundary record." She looked at him sideways. "Is that the truth, or are you inventing a reason?" He met her gaze. "Both," he said honestly. She held his gaze for a moment, then she nodded. "Then I will make coffee," she said, and turned and walked into the schoolhouse, and Isaac Quinn stood in the sun with his level and his tools and a feeling in his chest that was terrifying and clarifying in equal measure. The morning moved forward. Esther boiled coffee on the small iron stove in the corner of the schoolroom, the one she used to keep the place warm in the cold months, and which smelled of wood smoke and chalk dust, and the particular sweetness of children's industry, pencil shavings and primer ink, and the soap residue from 30 small hands wiped on aprons. She moved around the room while the water heated, straightening desks that did not need straightening, looking at the drawings the older students had pinned to the wall, trying not to listen too carefully to the sounds of Isaac working outside, the measured clang of metal against metal, the occasional quiet word he said to himself when something did not line up. She was aware of a thing happening inside her that she did not trust, a warming in the direction of hope that she had been careful to keep banked for 14 months. Thomas had been dead for 16 months now. The grief was not gone. It was not the kind of grief that went, but it had shifted from the breathtaking sharp-edged thing it had been in the beginning to something more like a landscape she had learned to live in, present everywhere, not lethal, no longer capable of stopping her mid-step in the middle of a sentence. Thomas Bell had been a good man. He had been generous and enthusiastic and fundamentally decent, and he had loved her without complication, and she had loved him the same way, and his death had been entirely senseless. A fever contracted at a bad water source outside of Albuquerque, and she had watched him die over 4 days in a rented room with a window that faced a brick wall. And there was nothing about that dying that was beautiful or instructive or redemptive in any way she could identify. It was simply a life extinguished before it had finished, and the plan they had made together had extinguished with it, and she had had to build a new plan out of what remained. The new plan was this: teach, be useful, do not fall apart. She had been executing this plan with considerable success for 14 months. She poured 2 cups of coffee when she heard his tools go quiet and carried them to the door, and he was standing back from the pole looking at it with his head slightly tilted, and the flag, which she had mended into one continuous piece of fabric again with small neat stitches that would outlast the canvas around them, was folded over his forearm. "It is straight," he said. She handed him the coffee. He took it and drank, and she stood beside him and looked up at the pole. "I am going to need your help to rehang it," she said. "I cannot reach the top clip from the roof. I can reach it from the ladder." They worked together to rehang the flag, him on the ladder holding the pole steady and threading the clips through the grommets, her on the ground managing the halyard, and when it finally unfurled in the morning wind, clean and whole and flying straight, she felt something surge in her chest that was grief and relief and something new she did not have a name for yet, all 3 at once. He came down the ladder and stood beside her. They looked at the flag together. "Thank you," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "You did the important part," he said. She turned to look at him, and the thing she had noticed in his eyes earlier was still there, that direct and careful honesty, and she thought, standing in the warm morning air of Caldera with the coffee going cold in her hand and the flag snapping clean above the schoolhouse, that this man was not pretending to be simpler than he was, which was something she had not encountered recently and could not remember how to handle. "The children will be arriving soon," she said. "Classes begin at 8. I will be out of your way." "You are not in my way," she said, and then pressed her lips together because that had come out differently than she meant it to, or possibly exactly as she meant it, which was worse. He picked up his tools and his level and his hat from the ground, and he looked at her once more with that expression she was going to spend the next several days trying to catalog and describe to herself in the privacy of her rented room at night, and he said, "I will be by tomorrow for the survey. Is 7 too early?" "7 is fine," she said. He walked away. She watched him go. Behind her, inside the schoolhouse, the clock on the wall clicked to 5 minutes before 8, and the first of her students, a small boy named Willie Crane, whose boots were always muddy regardless of the weather, came around the corner of the building and said, "Morning, Miss Bell." And she straightened herself and said, "Good morning, Willie, inside please, wipe your boots." And the day began. The survey the following morning lasted 2 hours longer than it should have because they kept talking. It started as professional, him explaining the boundary markers and why the existing ones were incorrectly placed, citing the original land grant documentation from 1847 and the secondary claim filed in 1866, and the territorial court ruling of 1879 that had been appealed and was still unresolved, and she had listened with the particular intensity she brought to everything, asking questions that were better than his briefings usually received, because she had a trained mind and was not afraid to expose what she did not know in order to understand it better. Then it had moved sideways into the history of the land itself, because she had been reading about the Pueblo communities that had farmed the valley long before any American deed had been filed on it, and she felt about that the way she felt about most injustices, which was a kind of burning, steady fury that expressed itself as extremely pointed inquiry, and he had engaged with that directly rather than deflecting it, which had surprised her. "The mapping I do," he said, looking out over the valley floor where the morning shadows were still long and cool, "documents what is claimed. It does not make the claims right. Does that trouble you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It troubles me a good deal." She looked at him. "Most men in your position would not say so. Most men in my position would not be having this conversation," he said. They looked at each other in the early morning light, and something passed between them that was more than the sum of the words, a recognition of shared ground, and Esther felt the warmth she had been trying to bank flare up again, brighter and more difficult to ignore. Over the next 2 weeks he found reasons to be at the schoolhouse. Some were legitimate survey business. Some were less clearly so. He repaired the hinge on the supply closet door that had been sticking since March. He brought a new length of rope for the flagpole halyard when the old one frayed. He came by on a Saturday morning when school was not in session and found her reorganizing the books on the shelf according to a new system she had devised, and he sat on one of the student desks and talked with her for 3 hours about everything from the territorial politics of New Mexico to the novels of Charles Dickens, which they had both read and disagreed productively about. She noticed that he asked about Thomas without the careful awkwardness most people brought to the subject, not out of morbid curiosity, but with the quiet, genuine interest of someone who wanted to understand what her life had been. She told him things she had not told anyone in Caldera, not because she had been hiding them, but because no one had made the space to hear them. She told him about the land grant and what Thomas had planned to do with it, a small orchard and some cattle and a house with a south-facing window for her to read in the afternoons. She told him about the 4 days of the fever and the brick wall visible from the window. She did not cry, because she had already done all of that crying, and now she was on the other side of it, in the landscape of having loved and lost and continued, and she could speak from there plainly. He listened without trying to fix it or resolve it or offer the formulaic consolations. He just listened, and when she finished he said, "He sounds like someone worth grieving," and that was so exactly the right thing to say that she had to look away from him out the window for a moment. The town was paying attention. Caldera in 1882 was a town of approximately 340 souls, enough people to have a social architecture and a rumor economy, not enough people for anyone's business to remain their own. Esther had understood this from the beginning and had accepted it as the terms under which frontier community life operated. The gossip machine had noticed Isaac Quinn's visits to the schoolhouse within about 4 days of the first one and had been generating interpretations ever since. Some of the interpretations were benign. Widow schoolteacher, steady working man, nothing improper occurring. What was everyone so exercised about? Some of the interpretations were not benign, and those came from a particular direction. Dale Whitmore. Dale Whitmore was the man who ran the land office in Caldera, a broad-shouldered, self-important man of 40 with a drooping mustache, and the specific kind of confidence that comes from having held the same small power for a long time in a place where no one has challenged it. He had been attentive to Esther Bell since her arrival in Caldera, in the way that a man attentive to the wrong reasons is attentive, pressing, proprietary, never quite crossing a visible line but always making the space feel smaller. She had managed him carefully, maintaining a professional distance without creating an open conflict, because she needed the town council's support for her position, and Whitmore had a seat on that council, and she was not naive about the power he held over her livelihood. But Whitmore had a hidden motive in this particular situation that Esther did not immediately see. Isaac Quinn's survey work was exposing irregularities in the land office records, clerical errors that were too consistent to be accidental, and at least 2 cases where the boundary markers in the field did not match the filed documents in ways that benefited specific landowners who happened to be friends of Dale Whitmore's. Isaac had said nothing about this to Esther because it was not her problem and he was still gathering evidence, but the investigation was progressing, and Whitmore had caught wind of it through channels that small, corrupt officials always seemed to possess. Whitmore began manufacturing reasons to drop by the schoolhouse at odd hours. He began making remarks in the general store and at the barber shop that had a particular insinuating quality, nothing provable, nothing direct, but designed to establish an impression, an unstable woman making poor choices, a stranger with unclear motives, a situation that decent Caldera citizens might need to concern themselves with. Esther heard about this third hand from Martha Crane, Willie's mother, who was her nearest ally in town and a woman of practical loyalty and considerable intelligence, and she sat with the information for a day before deciding what to do with it. She went to find Isaac. She found him at his survey table in the room he rented at the boarding house, the door open, maps spread across every surface, and she knocked on the door frame and said, "I need to understand what is actually happening here." He looked up. He read something in her expression and immediately cleared a chair for her. "Sit down." She sat. She told him what Martha had said. She watched his face go through several internal calculations, and she recognized in that moment that he had been managing information, protecting her from something, and the recognition brought a flash of anger. "You know something," she said. "You have known it for a while." He met her eyes. "Yes, tell me," he told her. He spread the maps and the documents and explained the irregularities in plain language, the boundary falsifications, the filed records that did not match the markers, the names of the landowners who had benefited. He told her that Whitmore was almost certainly at the center of it, that the evidence was not yet complete, that he had sent a preliminary report to the General Land Office in Washington and was waiting for guidance on next steps. She listened to all of it and then said, "And you did not tell me because you did not want me involved." "Because I did not want you to carry it," he said. "You carry enough." "That is not your decision to make," she said quietly, and the quietness of it was more serious than anger. He was silent for a moment. "You are right," he said. "I am sorry. I reverted to an old pattern I thought I had broken." She looked at him. "What pattern?" "Deciding alone what the person beside me needs to know, leaving them outside the problem." He paused. "I was married once. I made that mistake consistently for a year and a half. She left and she was right too." Esther had not known he had been married. She absorbed this information, all of its implications. "How long ago?" 9 years. "And you have been alone since?" "I have been working since," he said. which is not the same thing, but I have sometimes used it as a substitute. She looked at him for a long moment, this careful, honest, complicated man who had climbed her ladder and straightened her flagpole and sat in her schoolroom and listened to her talk about Thomas without flinching, and who had just told her his worst truth without being asked. "I am not someone who needs to be managed," she said. "I know that," he said. "I have known it since the first morning. You were on that roof fixing a problem the whole town had ignored, and you were doing it alone because that is what you do. And I thought then that what you needed was not someone to take the problem away, but someone to help you with the part you could not reach." She was quiet for a moment. The sounds of the boarding house came through the open door, distant voices, a door closing somewhere, the evening wind starting up. "That is one of the truest things anyone has said to me in a long time," she said. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and the careful distance he had been maintaining between them since the beginning, that deliberate, respectful gap, was gone, not crossed aggressively but simply dissolved, and they were just two people sitting in a small room in Caldera, New Mexico, in the failing light of an August evening, seeing each other. "Esther," he said, just her name. The way he said it was a question and a statement at the same time. "I know," she said, and she did know. She had known since the morning on the roof. He reached across the survey maps and took her hand in both of his, and she let him, and for a moment neither of them moved, and the thing that had been building between them for 2 weeks settled into a shape they could both recognize. "This is going to be complicated," she said. "Everything worth doing is complicated," he said. She looked down at their joined hands on top of the maps that were going to expose Dale Whitmore's corruption and possibly make their lives very difficult for a while. She thought about the torn flag and the small, careful stitches, and the way a thing that had come apart could be made whole again with enough patience and the right materials. "Tell me the rest of what you know," she said. All of it. He did. The next 3 weeks were a siege in slow motion. Whitmore had not survived this long in a position of small, corrupt power by being unintelligent. He could not see exactly what Quinn's survey was revealing, but he could see that it was revealing something, and he moved to protect himself with the blunt instruments available to him. He went to the town council and raised concerns about the territorial survey process, suggesting that outside agents sent by Washington were not always working in the best interests of local communities, and that certain documented surveying mistakes in other territories had resulted in families losing land they had worked for decades. He said these things in a measured, concerned tone that made them sound like civic duty rather than self-protection, and 2 of the 5 council members were persuaded, not because they were corrupt themselves, but because they were afraid and Whitmore was a familiar quantity, and the territorial government was not. He also moved against Esther. The mechanism was elegant in its ugliness. He approached Reverend Stokes, the minister of the Methodist church that occupied the corner of Main and 2nd, and expressed private concern about the schoolteacher's conduct. Nothing specific, nothing provable, just a quiet, systematic seeding of doubt. A woman in her position ought to be more careful about the company she kept. The children in her charge were impressionable. The town had trusted her, and he hoped that trust was not being misplaced. Reverend Stokes, to his credit, did not act immediately on these suggestions, but he did speak to the head of the school board, a dry goods merchant named Emmett Park, and Emmett Park called an emergency meeting of the school board for the 2nd Thursday of September. Martha Crane came to Esther the morning before the meeting, her face tight with the effort of carrying bad news to someone she cared about. She told Esther everything, including the parts that Whitmore would not want her to know he had said, because Martha Crane had a 14-year-old daughter who had been in Esther's class for a year, and had come home from school every single day with something new she had learned and was excited about. And Martha Crane did not forgive attacks on people who had earned her loyalty. Esther sat with this information in the kitchen of Martha's house, and drank the coffee Martha put in front of her and thought very carefully. She could see the trap. It was clear once you knew where to look. Whitmore was not primarily interested in destroying her. She was simply a useful pressure point to create leverage. to make Isaac's position in Caldera untenable, to generate enough local opposition to the survey that its findings could be dismissed or delayed. If the schoolteacher's reputation was in question because of her association with the surveyor, and the surveyor was viewed as a destabilizing outside agent, the whole investigation became politically complicated in ways that were difficult for Washington to overcome from a distance. She told Isaac that evening. He listened without interrupting, and she watched him move through anger and then out the other side of it into the particular focused clarity that she had come to recognize in him when a problem needed solving. "I am going before the school board tomorrow night," she said. "I will come with you." "No," she said. "This one is mine." He looked at her. "Esther, you coming with me makes it about you and me," she said. "And this should not be about you and me. This should be about whether I am a good teacher because I am, and whether the children in this town deserve that because they do." He sat back. He was quiet for a moment. "You have thought this through. I have thought this through. And after the meeting, she said, "we are going to finish the survey documentation together because I am very good at detailed record keeping, and you need someone who can organize and index a large amount of evidence in a way that will hold up to review. And I am that person. I have been managing the school's land documentation for over a year, and I know exactly how these records are supposed to look and precisely how Whitmore's do not." He stared at her. "You have been looking at the land office records." "I have been looking at the land office records for 6 weeks," she said. "Ever since you mentioned the disputed parcels and I realized that 3 of the families whose children are in my school were on disputed land. I did not know what I was looking for, but I knew something was wrong." He set down his coffee cup. "You did not tell me." She raised her eyebrows. He had the grace to almost smile. "Fair enough," he said. "We both had secrets." "No more secrets," she said. "No more secrets," he agreed. There was a moment between them that was warm and real, and completely without pretense. He reached across the table and pushed a strand of dark hair back from her face, a gesture so simple and intimate that she felt it all the way down her spine, and she turned her face slightly into his palm, just for a moment, before straightening and picking up the document she had been working from. "Now," she said, "let me show you what I found." They worked until past midnight, and the evidence that emerged from their combined knowledge was more comprehensive than either had assembled alone. Esther had found 3 additional irregularities in the school parcel records that connected directly to boundary falsifications Isaac had documented in the field. The picture was clear and damning. Whitmore had been systematically adjusting boundary records to move property lines in ways that benefited a network of about 6 local landowners. The adjustments small enough in each case to avoid obvious notice, accumulative enough over the 12 years of his tenure to represent a significant redistribution of land, and therefore wealth. One of the families whose land had been reduced by this process was a Pueblo family named Tafoya who had held their parcel by continuous occupation since before any American deed existed. They had been losing ground piece by piece for a decade and did not know why. When Esther saw the Tafoya documentation, she sat very still for a moment and then said very quietly, "This is the worst of it." "Yes," Isaac said, "they have to know." "They will know," he said. "This goes into the full report. There will be restitution. It will take time through the courts, but the evidence will compel it." "Time," she said, with the bitterness of someone who knew what time cost people who were already losing. "I know," he said. "I know, Esther." She looked at him across the lamplit table, surrounded by maps and documents and the accumulated proof of a hidden wrong, and she thought about all the ways that the world was broken, and all the ways that patient, determined people could work to mend it, one stitch at a time, and she thought that if she was going to continue doing that work, having someone beside her who saw the same things and felt the same anger and brought the same commitment would make it possible to go further than she could alone. "I love you," she said. It came out simply and directly, the way she did most things, without preamble or ceremony. He looked at her for a moment, and she watched something in his face unlock, some last held breath release, and he said, I have loved you since the morning on the roof. I watched you up there and I thought, there is a person doing the necessary thing because it needs doing and not for any other reason, and I thought I have never seen anything more worth staying for in my life." She looked at him. "You stayed." "I stayed," he said. She stood up and walked around the table, and he stood too, and she put her hand against his chest where his heart was beating, and he put his arms around her carefully, as if she were something he wanted to hold correctly, and she pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment and felt the tension she had been carrying for a very long time ease slightly, not gone, not magically resolved, but shared, and sharing it made it possible to carry. "Tomorrow," she said into his shoulder. "Tomorrow," he agreed. The school board meeting was held in the back room of Emmett Park's dry goods store, which smelled of coffee beans and molasses, and the particular dry goods smell of unbleached cotton fabric folded on shelves. There were 5 board members present: Emmett Park, Martha Crane, who served as the parent representative, 2 local businessmen named Garrett and Hooper, and a retired schoolteacher named Miss Florence Ward, who was 71 years old, had taught in this territory for 38 years, and who had a tolerance for nonsense that was approximately 0. Dale Whitmore was also present. He had not been invited but had arrived claiming a right to speak as a town council member, and Emmett Park, who was not a confrontational man, had let him sit. Esther walked in carrying a leather folder. She was wearing her best dress, not because she was trying to impress anyone but because she understood the symbolic weight of presentation, and she had come to fight, and you fought in your best. She looked at Whitmore when she entered. He looked back at her with the mild, confident expression of a man who did not think he was in serious danger. She looked away from him and addressed the board. She spoke for 20 minutes. She began with her record. The attendance figures, which had improved by 30% since her arrival, the examination results of her students against the territorial standard, the number of children who were now reading above their grade level, the improvements to the schoolhouse itself that she had undertaken largely at her own expense. She spoke about the flag, not sentimentally but precisely. The storm, the damage, the 3 days no one acted, her decision to act, the reason for it, which was that the children in her care deserved to look at something whole and maintained and taken seriously. Then she paused and looked at Whitmore directly. "I have also been asked to address concerns about my character and my conduct. I will address them directly, because I do not believe that concern for my conduct is the primary motivation for this meeting being called." The room was very quiet. "The primary motivation," she said, "is that a man in this room is afraid of what an accurate land survey is going to reveal about the records of the land office he has run for 12 years. The association between me and the surveyor conducting that survey is being used as a tool to discredit both of us and delay the completion of work that will expose significant fraud." Whitmore stood up. "Now see here, Miss Bell, this is entirely out of order, making accusations in a public. I have documentation," Esther said. She opened the leather folder and laid papers on the table, one by one, organized and indexed and cross-referenced with the precision of a woman who had been keeping careful records her entire professional life. The boundary irregularities, the falsified coordinates, the names of the benefiting landowners, the Tafoya parcel, 3 additional families. A timeline of the adjustments, clearly dated and sourced. Whitmore's face went through several colors. Miss Florence Ward picked up the papers nearest to her and began reading with the focused attention of someone who had seen a great deal in 38 years and was not surprised but was very serious. Emmett Park read over her shoulder. Martha Crane's expression was controlled fury. Garrett and Hooper looked uncomfortable and then, as the papers passed along the table, increasingly alarmed. "This is a matter for the General Land Office and the territorial courts," Esther said, "and it is already in their hands. I am presenting it to this board because the school parcel is directly implicated in the fraudulent adjustments, and because the families of several children in this school have been harmed, including the Tafoya family, who I would ask the board to consider particularly as you discuss next steps." She closed the folder and stood straight. "If the board wishes to discuss my conduct in the schoolroom and my fitness to continue teaching, I am glad to have that conversation. But I would ask that it be separated from any discussion of interests that are not about the children." There was a silence. Miss Florence Ward set down the papers and looked at Dale Whitmore over her reading glasses with an expression that would have made a braver man consider his life choices. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I believe this meeting does not concern you. I believe you should leave." Whitmore looked around the room and found no allies. He had miscalculated. He had believed that what he was facing was a widow schoolteacher with a conflict of interest, manageable, dismissible. What he had faced instead was a woman with documentation, a network of community trust, and the particular fearlessness that comes from having already survived the worst thing that was likely to happen to her. He picked up his hat and left. The school board voted unanimously to retain Esther Bell. She walked out of Emmett Park's dry goods store into the cool September evening and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, breathing. The stars were extraordinary out here, the way they always were in this high desert country, a density of light that never failed to make her feel small and steadied at the same time. Isaac was leaning against the post of the lamp across the street. He had said he would not come to the meeting, and he had kept that promise, but he had also apparently been unable to stay away entirely, and she found she could not hold that against him. She walked across the street. "Well," he said. "They kept me," she said. He exhaled. She could see the relief in him. "And Whitmore." Florence Ward threw him out of the meeting. He looked at her. A slow smile broke across his face, genuine and warm and slightly dazzled, and she thought, standing in the lamplight in Caldera with the September stars overhead and the smell of wood smoke and dry earth on the air, that she would like to see that smile every day for the rest of her life. "Come here," she said, and stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he wrapped her up in return, and they stood there in the middle of the street not caring who saw, because the only thing she had left to manage was her happiness, and she had decided to stop being careful with that. The full report Isaac sent to the General Land Office in Washington arrived at the same time as a telegram from the regional inspector, who had been tracking irregularities in New Mexico land records from Santa Fe, and had been looking for exactly the kind of comprehensive field documentation that Isaac's survey provided. The inspector arrived in Caldera on the 12th of October aboard the stage from Albuquerque, a thin, precise man named Cordell with wire spectacles, and a briefcase full of supplementary evidence that confirmed and extended everything Isaac and Esther had documented. The legal proceedings against Whitmore were initiated by the end of October. He was removed from his position pending investigation, which was, in the particular way of territorial legal proceedings in 1882, going to take a considerable amount of time to fully resolve, but the removal was immediate, and the evidence was comprehensive, and everyone in Caldera understood that the era of Dale Whitmore managing the town's land records was finished. The Tafoya family was notified directly by Inspector Cordell, and Isaac drove out to their property with the inspector to explain the findings and what the restitution process would look like. Esther went with them, not because she had any official role, but because she had 3 Tafoya children in her classroom, and because she felt the responsibility personally, and the matriarch of the Tafoya household, a dignified woman named Alina, had listened to the full explanation, and at the end had looked at Esther with an expression of careful assessment that eventually resolved into something warmer. "You taught my grandchildren," Alina said. "I do," Esther said. "Are you teaching them that this land is theirs?" "I am teaching them every true thing I know," Esther said, "including that." Alina had nodded and offered them coffee, which they drank in the autumn light in the courtyard of the Tafoya house, and on the way back to town Esther had been quiet, sitting beside Isaac on the wagon seat with her shoulder against his, looking out at the landscape they were crossing, the high desert turning its autumn colors, the mountains in the distance carrying the first snow on their peaks. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am thinking about justice," she said, "and how slowly it moves and how you have to decide whether to keep believing in it anyway." "Do you?" he asked. "Keep believing in it?" "I do," she said. "I have decided it is a requirement. The alternative is to stop fighting, and I am not able to do that." He took her hand from her lap and held it in his eyes on the road, and said, "I know, it is one of the things I love most about you." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "What are the other things? Do you want the full list?" "I have time." He thought for a moment, seriously, as if the question deserved serious treatment. "The way you think, the way you refuse to be managed. The way you can be furious and kind at exactly the same time. The way you stitched that flag with small, perfect stitches when no one else would go up on the roof. The way you listened when I told you about Clara without making me feel like a failure for it. The way you said I love you at midnight over a table of maps without any preparation or ceremony because you meant it and you saw no reason to delay saying it." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a good list. I can continue." "Later," she said, and lifted her head and kissed him. There on the wagon seat on the road back to Caldera, with the mountains and the autumn light and the whole wide sky, a proper unhurried kiss, and the horses walked on without needing direction. Isaac Quinn had a decision to make. His contract with the General Land Office ran until the end of December. The survey of the Caldera district would be complete well before that. After December, there were 3 pending assignments available to him, one in the Texas Panhandle, one in the Colorado Territory, and one in the upper reaches of the San Juan Basin, all of them months away from Caldera in country that was rough and remote. He had been moving from assignment to assignment for 9 years. He was good at it. It suited the part of him that had learned to travel light and keep his attachments portable. But standing in his rented room at the boarding house in October 1882, looking at the 3 assignment letters on his survey table, he understood with complete clarity that this part of his life was finished, that it had finished on a morning in late August when he had stood in the dust below a schoolhouse and watched a woman on a roof doing the necessary thing and had decided to stay. He needed to tell Esther about the assignments. He needed to tell her without making the choice feel like a sacrifice, because it was not a sacrifice. It was simply a rearrangement of priorities based on accurate information about what he valued, and he had learned enough about Esther Bell to know that she would refuse to be the reason he gave up something he loved if she thought he was giving it up reluctantly. He went to find her on a Sunday afternoon when the school was empty, and the town had the particular quiet of a day of rest. She was in the schoolroom doing the thing she sometimes did on Sunday afternoons, reading, not preparing lessons but simply reading for herself, a novel this time, and she looked up when he came in with the expression she had developed for him that was different from her expression for everyone else, warmer and more direct. He sat down across from her and put the 3 assignment letters on the desk between them. She read them. He watched her read them. He watched her face go through the calculation of what they meant, the distances involved, the timelines, and what it meant that he was showing them to her. "Tell me what you are thinking," she said. "I am thinking," he said, "that I have been looking for a place to stop moving for 9 years and I have found it. And I am thinking that the Territorial Land Office in Albuquerque has been trying to recruit me for 6 months to come on as a full-time staff surveyor managing the district out of a permanent office, which would mean I would be based here and traveling out from here, not the other way around. And I am thinking that this is what I want. But I need you to know that I am not choosing it for you. I am choosing it because it is what I want, and because you happen to be here, and because those 2 facts are entirely compatible." She looked at him for a long moment. "You have thought very carefully about how to say this." "Yes." "Because you knew that if it sounded like a sacrifice I would argue with you." "Yes." She looked at the assignment letters and then back at him. "Is the Albuquerque position genuinely something you want?" "It is genuinely something I want," he said. "The work here, the district work, it matters. The land disputes in this territory are going to take a generation to properly document and resolve, and I want to be part of that. Not because I am noble, but because it is the right work and I am good at it." She was quiet for a moment. "I believe you," she said. "Good," he said. "Then there is something else I want to say." She waited. He reached into his coat pocket and put a ring on the desk between them, not an elaborate ring. He knew her well enough to know that elaborate would be wrong. A plain gold band with a small inset turquoise stone in a setting that had been made by a Navajo silversmith in a town south of Albuquerque, simple and beautifully made. "Esther Bell," he said, "I would like to be your husband, if you will have me." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. And then she did the thing he had come to love most about her. She did not perform the moment. She did not cry or exclaim or reach for the response she thought she ought to have. She simply sat in it and felt it and then said, quietly and completely, "Yes." He put the ring on her finger. It fit. He had measured her ring size the week before by borrowing one of her rings from her coat pocket when she was distracted, which she would later find out and declare the most calculated romantic gesture she had ever encountered. She kissed him over the desk full of students' uncorrected exercises, and he kissed her back, and the afternoon light came through the schoolhouse windows golden and warm, and the flag above the roof snapped in the October breeze, whole and clean. They were married in December of 1882, on a clear cold day 2 weeks before Christmas, in the Methodist church with Reverend Stokes officiating, and Miss Florence Ward sitting in the front pew with an expression of profound satisfaction. Martha Crane cried happy tears. Willie Crane sat beside his mother with a clean face for once in his life and solemnly watched the proceedings. The Tafoya family came. Alina sat near the back, upright and dignified, and when the ceremony was over she came forward and pressed Esther's hands between hers and said something in Spanish that Esther would later ask Isaac to translate, which he did, several days later when she reminded him, and it was, "May you build something that lasts." The wedding supper was held in the larger room of the boarding house, not because they had nowhere else to hold it, but because Mrs. Garrity, who ran the boarding house, had been feeding Isaac for 4 months, and had developed a proprietary affection for both of them and had asked, plainly and without shame, if she could do the supper, and they had said yes. The supper lasted until late in the evening and included more whiskey than Esther usually accounted for, and a fiddle player named Drew who knew every dance tune from here to Missouri. And the schoolteacher and the surveyor danced on the boarding house floor until they were breathless and laughing, and the stars outside the windows were brilliant with cold. Isaac had accepted the Albuquerque staff position and had arranged his schedule so that his primary office would be established in Caldera, traveling out from there rather than from the territorial capital, which suited the work perfectly and meant that the small house he and Esther found at the edge of town, a 2-room adobe with a south-facing window that looked out across the valley toward the mountains, became the center of things. She had been very quiet the first time she stood in front of that south-facing window. He had noticed and had come to stand behind her, his hands on her shoulders, looking out over the same view. "Thomas wanted to build a house with a window like this," she said. "I know," he said. He had remembered. He never forgot things she told him. "I am not sad," she said. "I want you to know that. I am grateful. I am grateful that there is a window." "I know," he said. She turned and leaned against him, and he held her, and outside the mountains were white at their tops, and the valley floor was brown and gold, and the sky was the impossible blue of the high desert winter. The first year of their marriage was not without difficulty, because nothing real is without difficulty, and they were 2 strong-willed people who had each been alone and self-sufficient for a long time, and who had habits and preferences that required the ongoing negotiation of shared life. They argued about the wood stove, about the temperature at which a room was adequately heated, Isaac preferring considerably warmer than Esther, who had been raised in Ohio winters and had developed a hardy indifference to cold that baffled him. They argued about her working hours, not about whether she should work. He would never have raised that but about the hours, the late evenings when she was still at the schoolhouse grading by lamplight when she was exhausted, and he came to get her more than once with the direct intention of making her eat supper and go to sleep. She found this bossy and said so. He said that finding it bossy did not make it wrong. She threw her grading book at him. He caught it. She started laughing despite herself. They were good at this, at the recovery from argument, at not carrying grievance past the moment it was finished. He was absent 3 weeks in April when a survey assignment in the northern part of the district ran longer than expected, and she wrote him letters that she sent by stage and rider, and which arrived in batches, 3 or 4 at a time, and he carried them with him and read them over and over in the way you read something that has the quality of actual company in the wilderness of being far from someone you love. She missed him with a directness and uncomplicated force that surprised her. It was different from the grief of Thomas's absence, because Thomas had not chosen to go and would have given anything to stay. Isaac was coming back. She knew he was coming back. The missing was therefore a temporary inconvenience rather than a wound, and she understood in that April of 1883 the difference between loss and longing, between grief and the ordinary ache of a person temporarily away from their preferred center of gravity. He came back on a Tuesday morning when the desert was beginning its transformation into spring, the light softer and the air carrying the first hint of warmth. And she was at the schoolhouse when she heard the wagon, and she went to the door and watched him drive up the street with his equipment cases stacked in the back, and his hat brim pushed up, and that expression on his face that was already looking for her before he could see her clearly. She went down the schoolhouse steps. He stopped the wagon and climbed down, and she walked into him with enough force that he had to step back, and he laughed and held her and pressed his face into her hair and said her name against her temple, and she thought that this specific moment of return, the warmth and weight of him and the familiar particular smell of him and the laughing, was one of the best things she had ever experienced in her life. "Did you eat?" she said into his shoulder. "Not well," he said. "I have stew on," she said. "I know," he said. "I could smell it from the end of the street." She pulled back and looked at his face, checking him the way you check someone who has been away in rough country, for the wear of it, for the things 3 weeks of hard work in remote places does to a person, and he was tired but fine, more than fine, and his eyes were doing the same checking of her. "How is everything?" he said. "Everything is very good," she said. "I have things to tell you." Something in the way she said it made him look at her more carefully. "What things?" She was smiling in a way she usually managed better than this. "Come inside," she said. "Let me feed you first." He looked at her for another moment, and then something in her face resolved what he was looking for, and he said, very quietly, "Esther." "Come inside, Isaac." He unhitched the horse and led it to the small stable beside the house and came in through the back door, and she was at the stove, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, and she turned around, and her expression was the clearest thing he had ever seen, open and happy, and just the smallest edge of afraid in the way that every enormous good thing carries a small edge of the fear of its own magnitude. "We are having a child," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and she was in his arms and his face was in her hair, and they stood in the kitchen with the stew on the stove and the spring light coming through the window and the mountains out there beyond the glass, and he held her with the particular careful fierceness of a man who understands that he is holding everything he needs. "When?" he said. "November," she said, "approximately." "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well. I am annoyed by the mornings, but perfectly well." He pulled back to look at her, and his eyes were bright, and he was not performing any of it, not the joy or the slight terrified amazement. It was all real and present, and she loved him for it. "Sit down," she said. "Eat." "You sit down," he said. "I will serve. I am not an invalid." "No," he said, "but I have been away 3 weeks and I would like to do something for you." She sat. He served the stew. They ate in the late morning light of their kitchen, and he told her about the survey and the country in the north of the district, and the people he had met, and she told him about the school and the progress of the students, and a letter she had received from Inspector Cordell, confirming that the Whitmore case was moving through the territorial courts, and that the Tafoya family's land claim was being formally reviewed for restitution, which she told him with a satisfaction that was not triumphant but steady. The satisfaction of a thing moving correctly toward its right conclusion. The legal proceedings against Whitmore concluded in the autumn of 1883, while Esther was large with the baby and spending more time at home than usual because Miss Florence Ward had stepped in to take the school for the last 2 months of the term and had refused to take any argument about it, simply appearing on a Monday morning and telling Esther to go rest, with the particular authority of a woman who had been teaching for 38 years and would not be overruled. Whitmore was found guilty on 6 counts of fraudulent alteration of land records and sentenced to 7 years in the territorial prison in Santa Fe. It was not a perfect resolution. The families who had lost land had lost years of use and improvement that no court decision would restore, and the legal process of restitution for the Tafoya parcel would take another 2 years to complete. But the record was corrected, and the man responsible was held to account, and Esther sat in the kitchen of her adobe house with the south-facing window and read the verdict notice that Isaac brought home from the telegraph office and felt, if not peace, then the particular satisfaction of having pushed a stone up a very long hill far enough that it could not roll back. Their son was born in November of 1883, on a night when the wind was coming off the mountains with the first real cold of winter, and the birth was attended by a midwife named Rosa, whom Martha Crane had recommended, and Isaac was present throughout in the specific way that was unusual for the time and period, because Esther had told him plainly that she wanted him there, and he had not even considered refusing her. The labor was long and the night was cold, and several times the lamp flame bent in the draught from the window and threw moving shadows across the walls, and Isaac held her hand through all of it, steady and present without trying to manage what was not his to manage. And when the baby finally came, red-faced and outraged and magnificent, and Rosa placed him in Esther's arms, and she looked down at this small, furious person who had just arrived in the world. She heard Isaac make a sound beside her that she had never heard from him before, not quite a word, not quite anything, just a sound that was the pure acoustic expression of being changed. "Hello," Esther said to the baby. "We have been waiting for you. What will we call him?" Isaac said. His voice was rough. She had been thinking about this for months. "Thomas," she said, for his middle name. Thomas was a good man and he should be remembered in this family, and his first name. She looked at Isaac. "What was your father's name?" Isaac looked at her. "Henry. Henry Thomas Quinn," she said. "Is that all right?" He could not speak for a moment. He nodded. He took her hand and pressed it to his lips, which was not something he usually did, and the simpleness of it, the unguarded tenderness, made her eyes fill. "Henry Thomas Quinn," she said again, and the baby, as if hearing his name spoken into the world for the first time, opened his eyes and looked at her with the unfocused ancient gaze of the newborn. And the wind came off the mountains and the lamp burned steady, and outside the flag above the schoolhouse, visible through the window, snapped in the dark. Henry was a remarkable baby, and then a remarkable small child, and then a remarkable boy, in the entirely biased assessment of his parents and the somewhat more reliable assessment of Miss Florence Ward, who was still teaching at 73, and who said with authority that the child had his mother's mind and his father's steadiness, which was the best possible combination. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's quality of attention, that capacity to look at something as if she were seeing it from every angle at once, and he was interested in everything: the maps on his father's table, the books on his mother's shelf, the way the land worked and the way words worked and the way people worked. And Esther watched him grow with the particular joy of a teacher who has a student who genuinely loves learning, and the additional joy of a mother who is watching that student be her own child. In the spring of 1885, a second child arrived, a daughter this time, whom they named Clara Rose. Clara because Isaac wanted to honor a difficult past honestly rather than pretend it had not happened, which Esther had loved him for when he explained it. And Rose because Esther had been given a rose cutting from Elena Tafoya's garden the previous summer, and the rose had survived the winter, which seemed like a thing worth commemorating. Clara Rose was very different from Henry, louder and more immediate in her needs and her joys, and she had Esther's coloring and Isaac's stubbornness, which made for an interesting combination in a 2-year-old. And the house that had been 2 rooms was extended by another room the summer she was born by Isaac and 2 men from town, and the extension had a window that caught the afternoon light, which Esther claimed immediately for her reading. The Tafoya land restitution was fully settled in 1885, 2 years after the initial court proceedings. The full contested acreage restored to the family's title, with a formal territorial acknowledgement that the prior boundary adjustments had been fraudulent. Elena came to the school when the decision was published and asked for Esther, and when Esther came out into the yard, Elena took both her hands and said nothing for a moment, and Esther understood that some moments did not require words and held the older woman's hands and let the silence be what it was. Caldera grew. The railroad, which had been coming for years in a series of delays and engineering setbacks, finally arrived in 1886, a spur line from the main Santa Fe Railroad route that connected the town to Albuquerque and through Albuquerque to the rest of the country. The arrival of the railroad brought new people and new money, and a new school building that was twice the size of the old one, with a proper slate board and a supply of books ordered from a publisher in St. Louis, and a second teaching position that allowed Esther to manage the upper grades, while a young teacher named William Frost handled the lower grades. The new school building was dedicated on a September morning in 1886 with a small ceremony that the town council organized. And when it came time to raise the flag, someone on the council suggested that Esther Bell, who had mended the old flag and kept the school going through its difficult years, should be the one to run it up. She had taken the halyard and looked up at the clean iron pole above the new building, and she had thought about that August morning in 1882 when she had climbed onto the roof with needle and thread, and she had thought about the men who had watched and the one man who had stayed, and she had looked out at the small crowd and found Isaac in it, standing near the back with Henry on his shoulders so the boy could see. And Henry was 4 years old and absolutely fascinated by the flag, and had been asking questions about it for 3 days. She pulled the halyard and the flag went up clean and full and snapping in the September wind, and she watched it go up and felt exactly what she had felt that first morning, the complicated rush of grief and relief and love and purpose, all the things that had brought her here and kept her here and given her work that mattered and a life she had not planned but had built, stitch by careful stitch, out of what remained after the worst thing and into something that was. She understood standing in the September morning with the flag going up and her husband watching her from across the crowd, and her son asking his father very loudly why the flag had those particular colors, entirely and genuinely enough. She tied off the halyard and turned to the crowd, and Isaac caught her eye and did the thing he had done since the very beginning. He stayed where he was and held her gaze with those dark, steady eyes, and the expression she had never found a complete word for, the one that was recognition and honesty and the willingness to be fully present in the moment without looking away. She walked through the crowd to him. Henry immediately climbed from his father's shoulders to hers because he preferred the elevation, and she staggered slightly under the transfer of a 4-year-old, and Isaac steadied her, his hand at her back, and she could hear him trying not to laugh. "That was dignified," he said. "Thank you for your observation," she said, adjusting Henry's weight on her shoulders. "Mama, why is it red and white and blue?" Henry said directly into her ear. "Because someone chose those colors 100 years ago," she said. "Why did they choose those ones?" "That," she said, "is a very long story for after supper. I want to hear it now." "Henry, yes, after supper." Henry considered this with the serious expression he had inherited from his father when processing information he was not entirely satisfied with. "Fine," he said. Isaac's hand was still at her back. She leaned into him slightly, a small private thing in the middle of the public morning, and he responded in kind, his thumb moving once in a gesture that said everything necessary without requiring any words at all. They walked home through the streets of Caldera in the September morning, the new school behind them and the flag above it, and the mountains at the edge of the world carrying the summer's last light. And Henry asked 17 more questions before they reached the door, and Clara Rose, who had been left at home with Martha Crane for the ceremony, was waiting at the gate with her arms out for her mother. And the house was warm and full and ordinary and entirely real. That evening after supper, which was beans and cornbread and the last of the summer tomatoes, and after Henry had been given the full history of the American flag's design, in an explanation that took 45 minutes and branched into several related topics including the Revolutionary War, the construction of Philadelphia, and why some stars on old flags had fewer points than others. And after both, children had been put to bed with the particular extended negotiations of bedtime. Esther and Isaac sat on the back step of the house in the cool dark with coffee, looking out at the mountains. The night sky was full above them, the stars of the high desert in September, so many and so bright that they seemed to press down, and the mountains were dark shapes against a slightly lighter dark, and the air smelled of sage and wood smoke, and the particular end-of-summer smell of the land preparing itself for the cold. "Are you happy?" he said. It was not a question he asked often, not because he did not care, but because he usually knew the answer, reading her with the accuracy of a man who had been paying close attention for 4 years. Tonight he was asking because the day had been one of those days that contained multiple kinds of feeling at once, the ceremony and the flag and the new beginning of the school and the memory of the old beginning of everything, and he wanted to know where she was in all of it. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "Yes," she said. "I am happy in a way that is not simple, if that makes sense. It is not the happiness of everything being easy. It is the happiness of being in the right place doing the right work with the right person and knowing it. That is not small." "No," he said, "it is not small." "Are you?" she asked. He looked at the mountains for a moment. "I used to think that happiness was something that happened to you if you managed your life correctly," he said. "If you did the right work and kept your obligations and did not make the large mistakes, I thought it was a reward for correct living. And now I think it is something you choose," he said. "Not once but continuously. You choose to be present, and you choose to let the person beside you actually matter, and you choose to do work that connects to something real. And if you make those choices often enough, they accumulate into a life that is worth living." She looked at him. "That is a very good answer. I have had some years to work it out." She set down her coffee and leaned into his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the dark with the stars and the mountains and the sound of the desert night, the distant coyote, the wind in the sage, the absolute quiet of a place that had no pretension about what it was. "I need to tell you something," she said. He was still. She could feel him attending. "We are going to have another child," she said. The arm around her tightened. She felt him exhale slowly, the warm, expansive breath of someone receiving a gift they had not expected. "When?" "Spring," she said. "Late spring, May, I think." He turned his face into her hair and was quiet for a moment. "3 children," he said. "Henry will be insufferable with a baby in the house." "Henry will be wonderful," she said firmly. "Henry will ask the baby 17 questions the moment it is born." She started laughing. He was laughing too, quietly against her hair, and the laughter was the best kind, the shared kind, the kind that comes from knowing the same people and the same life and the same small particular truths about the people you love. "We need more room," he said. "We need another room on the east side," she said. "I already measured." "Of course you did," he said. "Of course you already measured. I like to be prepared." "Esther Bell Quinn," he said, with the fond exasperation of a man who has been married 4 years to a woman who is almost always 3 steps ahead of everything. "You are the most thoroughly prepared person I have ever known." "That is a compliment," she said. "It is the highest compliment I know how to give," he said. She tilted her head up and he kissed her, there on the back step in the dark, properly and without any reservation, and the mountains held their dark shapes against the sky, and the stars burned overhead. And inside the house, their children slept the deep, clean sleep of children who are safe and loved, and have been told everything they needed to know about flags and colors, and the long, complicated history of the world, at least as much as a 4-year-old could hold before supper. The third child was born in May of 1887 as promised, and was a boy, and they named him James, after no one in particular, but because it was a good, solid name that the child seemed to suit immediately, arriving in the world considerably calmer than his sister had managed, blinking in the May morning light with an expression of philosophical acceptance that made the midwife Rosa laugh. Henry, who was 5, received the news of a second brother with a gravity that suggested he was taking on a serious responsibility. He asked to hold James within the first hour, sitting very carefully on the edge of the bed with his mother beside him, and held the baby with the focused attention of someone conducting an important examination. "His hands are very small," he said. "Yes," Esther said. "Were mine that small?" "Smaller," she said. Henry considered this information. "Will he learn to talk, eventually?" "When?" "In about a year." "That seems like a long time," Henry said. "It will go quickly," Esther said. Henry looked at his brother with the expression of someone revising a timeline. "I will teach him," he decided. "I know a lot of things." "I know you do," Esther said. From the doorway, Isaac watched his son holding his infant son on his wife's bed in the May morning, and felt the particular quality of feeling that he had no precise name for, the feeling that was beyond happiness and beyond gratitude, and was something more like a kind of astonished recognition that his life had become exactly and specifically what it should be, not what he had planned. He had planned nothing like this, but what he had arrived at by a sequence of choices that had begun on a morning in August of 1882, when he had stood in the dust below a schoolhouse and looked up at a woman on a roof doing the necessary thing, and had decided to stay. He was glad he had stayed. He would be glad for the rest of his life. The years moved the way good years do, not slowly and not fast, but with the texture of days that are full of specific and real things. The school terms and the surveys and the children growing, and the arguments, and the recoveries from arguments and the evenings on the back step, with coffee, and the long conversations that continued the same threads they had started on a table covered in maps and documents in a rented room, and never needed to finish, because they were the kind of conversations you live rather than conclude. The Whitmore case completed its full legal resolution in 1888, when the last of the appeal processes expired, and the judgment stood. The land records of the Caldera district, corrected and fully documented, were filed with the territorial government, and would stand as the foundational survey record for the district for the next 30 years. Isaac's name was on the documentation. So, in the acknowledgments section, was Esther's, which Isaac had insisted on and which the regional inspector had readily agreed to, noting that without her organizational work on the school parcel, records the case would have taken considerably longer. She had not expected it and had been moved to an unusual quiet when he showed her the filed documents. He had watched her run her finger along the line of her own name on the official record, and thought that he understood what it meant to her. Not vanity, never vanity, but the simple, deep satisfaction of having done work that mattered and having that work seen and named and placed in the permanent record of the territory she had come to belong to. "Thank you," she said. "It was not generosity," he said. "It was accuracy." "I know," she said. "That is why I am thanking you." She looked up at him with the expression that was still, after 6 years, the most clarifying thing he knew, open and direct and entirely present, and he thought, as he had thought many times and never quite got used to, that she was the most extraordinary person he had ever stood close enough to actually see. Caldera continued to grow and to change. The railroad brought new families and new conflicts and new possibilities. The school expanded again in 1889. 3 classrooms now, 2 teachers, a proper library funded by a donation from a Boston philanthropist who had passed through on the train and been buttonholed at the station by Esther Bell Quinn, who had a talent for pressing the case for her school's needs on anyone with the means to help and the momentary inability to escape. Miss Florence Ward retired in 1888 at the age of 77, which was a considerable time past when most people would have stopped, and at her farewell gathering in the schoolroom she said, in the manner of someone who had long since dispensed with roundabout communication, "Esther Bell arrived in this town 14 months after I had given up on finding a worthy successor, and she has surpassed everything I hoped for. She will teach in this schoolhouse until she decides to stop, which I expect will be some time in the next century." She had patted Esther's hand and drank her tea and looked at Isaac over the rim of the cup, with an expression that communicated clearly that she considered him an adequate husband for a remarkable woman, which was the highest assessment she was prepared to offer about any man. Miss Florence Ward died in the winter of 1890 in her own house in Caldera, at the age of 79, having spent more than 4 decades giving the children of the New Mexico Territory the kind of education that prepared them for the truth of the world rather than a comfortable lie about it. Esther spoke at her funeral, briefly and plainly, as she knew Florence would have preferred, and said that the best memorial she could offer was to continue the work, and then she had gone back to the school the following Monday and continued the work. On the morning of their 10th wedding anniversary, in December of 1892, Isaac woke before first light and built up the fire in the kitchen stove and made coffee, and Esther came out in her housecoat to find him at the kitchen table with coffee and a book, the house quiet around them, the children still asleep. She poured herself a cup and sat across from him. They looked at each other in the early dark with the fire throwing warmth and the coffee steaming, and 10 years between them, 10 years of the specific accumulation of shared life. "You should know," she said, "that if I had known in the beginning what it would actually be like, I would have found a way to make it happen sooner." He smiled slowly, the smile she still loved past all reason. "Is that so?" "It is so. The 14-month head start did allow me to complete the survey documentation," he said. "That is true," she said, "and it gave me time to mend the flag." "The flag," he said. "The flag," she said. They were quiet for a moment, remembering, not with sadness but with the warm quality of a very long story whose beginning you can look back on from a good distance and see clearly. "You know," he said, "I have thought about that morning many times. I have thought about why I stayed when the others left." "Why did you?" she said, though she knew she had always known. "Because you were doing something that needed doing," he said, "and you were doing it right. And I thought that if I left I would spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I had stayed to help with the part you could not reach." She looked at him across the kitchen table with the fire behind them and the dark morning outside and 10 years of the best possible life still warm in her hands like the coffee cup. "You did stay," she said. "I did," he said. "And I am glad," she said. "Every day, Isaac, I am glad every day." He reached across the table and took her hand. Outside the window, the mountains were invisible in the dark, present and permanent, holding the valley the way they had always held it, before any deed or boundary marker or survey line had been drawn across them. The flag above the schoolhouse was out there in the dark, mended and whole, flying above the place where the children of Caldera came every morning to learn the true and complicated shape of the world. The fire burned. The coffee steamed. Inside the house 3 children slept. Henry, who was 10 and full of questions and his father's steady eyes. Clara Rose, who was 7 and full of her own particular fierce sweetness. and James, who was 5 and had been born into the philosophical acceptance of a younger sibling, and wore it like a comfortable coat. And in the kitchen of a house with a south-facing window in Caldera, New Mexico Territory, in the winter of 1892, the schoolteacher and the surveyor held each other's hands across the table and watched the darkness begin its slow surrender to the morning light. And everything was whole, and everything was enough, and everything was, in the deep and permanent and unhurried way of the things that last, entirely and exactly right.